if it's not your muscles, you better have IQ, right? And if you don't have muscles and if you don't have IQ, God forbid, you're not necessarily, you know, being the man that you should be, right?
So, hi, Rajat. Thank you so much for being with us here today.
Hi, Prachi, how are you?
I'm doing well. So, from an engineer to a gender activist, can I call you that? Is that the right word?
Well, I would, at least I think of myself as right now a creator who is untangling gender largely for my own understanding. Activist is too, there's time for that title, I would assume.
Your first foray into talking about gender issues was Menstrupedia, which has, been a monumental success and it's everywhere. And
Hmm.
then you also worked on a book called She Can, You Can, and
Hmm.
now Boyish. So from talking about menstrual health to women's issues to now talking about masculinity. How did all of this come about? How did it begin?
I will start off by saying that majority of my background has been in the tech industry as an engineer. Well, that's no surprise, right? Because I think like a lot of boys, especially in the last era, have a lot of boys raised in middle class suburban Indian towns have, and that was their ticket to a livelihood, right? Uh, but all along this while, I've always been very curious of social science, I would say, right? And I have been lucky enough to have people even back in engineering school who were sort of very creative or had a more creative public side to themselves, right? I would say that engineering also is like very creative, but it's kind of like creative inside. Nobody gets to see the creativity when it comes to engineering. But I was lucky enough to have people who were creative sort of outside, right? Who could do creativity in sort of the public domain. I was on a break in 2012 from my life in tech, and I was exploring new ideas, and that is when Menstrupedia happened for me, co-founded by me, but largely driven by two very good close friends of mine. And since we go back, oh my God, it's been I think over 20 years at this point. So we go back a long time, right? So that really was very sort of helpful. It provided me a safe space where I could consider myself a creative, or I could consider myself chipping in on topics that I largely do not have like a pedigree on or do not have an academic background on, right? Like I have no academic background on menstrual health for certain, right? But Menstrupedia gave me a safe space where I got to learn that, first of all, I do have a viewpoint or I can cultivate one. It also sort of gave me an ability to learn that I can build a creative practice, right? Working towards a social issue. So it was an amazing sort of a learning opportunity, a 6 year long one. Yeah, that largely gave me the confidence to pick up the second book project,
Mm.
which took me about 2.5 years to bring to life. Finally, I'm here with Boyish, which is sort of my third project now. Yeah.
Yeah, that's amazing. For years now, we have been talking a lot about women's issues and how this patriarchal structure impacts the lives of women and young girls, but we don't have
Mhm.
enough conversation going on yet. It's starting, but there's not enough conversation going on around how the patriarchal system impacts men.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I will say that, it makes absolute sense that it started with the women, right? Like that we have been focusing on women issues. I believe that should still remain the focus. The body of work done in that dimension still does not justify, still like their problems yet to be solved, and this still does not justify the decades of problems that we have created. But all along, what I feel is, you certainly have to talk about boys as well if you have to solve the problem for girls too, right? There is just no way that you can end up solving for them without necessarily talking about boys, right? Because we kind of go, it's the yin and yang, and we kind of go hand in hand. There is no doubt, at least in my head, that if not equally, but patriarchy has certainly been harmful for boys, and it just sort of trains them in very weird ways, and the implications of which not only they are reeling under, but obviously other genders are impacted as well.
I 100% agree with the fact that the conversation needs to include men's issues as well. And that will only improve and further the cause of women's issues because we do
Hmm.
exist and we need to find a way to understand each other and to talk to each other. If we don't include men in the conversation, we are just talking amongst ourselves and repeating that same like cycle of, this is a problem, this is a problem, this is a problem. But if we have to move on to the solution stage, everybody has to be involved.
It creates a possibility of creating an echo chamber, first of all,
Yeah.
like where you're reverberating the same ideas, and that's never helpful. And two, I would say that women issues, to me, now sit under the umbrella of a larger topic, which is gender equality, right?
Yeah.
And equality of opportunity, right? So for that to be facilitated, you absolutely need to include the other person's viewpoint as well,
Yeah.
and that only will trickle down and help others rather than just boxing yourself in one community and talking about it.
Yeah. Speaking of equal opportunity, on paper, men and women, all genders currently have more or less equal opportunity, right? Legally
Hmm.
in our country, women are allowed to work. Legally
Hmm.
in our country, I'm not aware of any field, any profession where women are not allowed,
Absolutely.
even the army is recruiting women, the navy is recruiting. So all professions on paper,
Hmm.
it seems like men and women have equal rights. But I think one of the biggest impediments to that actually manifesting is the domestic sphere, and is this
Hmm.
idea that the professional life, public life belongs to men and the domestic life belongs to women.
Hmm.
And Boyish at some level is trying to challenge that.
Yeah, yeah, I would agree. So
Yeah.
yes, boys for me is largely a personal point of view and an argument that, like we, for lack of a better word, we don't need to bear the burden of being a provider if we want to design a sort of an equal society, right? That was certainly something that happened in the last several centuries. But now that we are talking, and now that we are, as you mentioned, we are here, at least on paper, you know, where we are designing a more equal world, it seems to me we are just like hanging on to some of the past. It's like a hangover, right? Like you're just still not over the past. And my argument with boys is like, you, for men to be the provider, they sort of like inherited or like absorbed certain principles, right? That okay, I have to be a very like a stoic personality, or I have to like not be kind. I have to always focus on wealth and social status, right? Because that in turn will trickle down and satisfy my provider status.
Yeah.
uh, and boys is largely just challenging that assumption right now.
I mean, you kind of answered that, but I would like to still dabble into it a little bit more. Do you think men have internalized this idea that they need to be the provider? And the reason I want to talk about it a little bit more is because, now, especially in the metropolitan, we're seeing more and more double income couples.
Right.
Both couples are working, the women are doing well. In some cases, the women are doing well enough to support the family, yet there
Mhm.
seems to be this attachment to the idea that the man still needs to earn enough and the man still needs
Absolutely.
to support the
Hmm.
family. So what do you think about that? Where do you think that comes from?
I mean, first of all, I agree to that there is that sense of attachment of, if I'm not providing for my family, then am I sort of man enough, right? Or am I doing my part, right? And it comes from largely two things, right? As I've mentioned, the first one being largely a hangover of centuries of behaving that way, uh, and not taking a moment to reflect that while that was perhaps needed in the past, the situation has changed, right? And hence your your responsibilities can change as well. You don't need to be the only provider, right?
Yeah.
And the other one I will also add, like the second thing I feel is that, we just never grew up in respecting or seeing ourselves other than our outside of our jobs, right? Or outside of our financial or social status, right? Like, it is hard for millennial men to really have a sense of identity if you strip out, you know their jobs and financial status. That's my opinion. I mean, obviously, I'm sure there are people who would be different, but by and large, I feel millennial men, if you strip out their jobs and their financial status, they they lose their sense of identity. Men need to cultivate like their own identities outside of that solo tunnel vision viewpoint. I feel.
Yeah, yeah. But that's so interesting. I never, of course, like I don't know what a lived experience of a man is like, but I don't think I realized how deeply intertwined a man's sense of identity is to his career or professional life. And now that you say it, it makes so much sense because, you know, just like young girls are groomed to be nice and forgiving and nurturing, and that does become a very integral part of our identity.
Hmm.
Young boys are also groomed to be, to study hard, to choose subjects that will get them, land them good jobs, to
Right.
take care of the finances. Like women in our country have zero financial literacy because that's just not a focus, when you're raising a girl.
Absolutely. Yeah, and the vice versa of it is like men who are not financially literate, and
Yeah.
let's say are more in like liberal arts, are not considered man enough, right? Like, so, you know, and I will add that, the sense of provider is, at least in my opinion, and I grew up in like tier 4 towns slash villages in India, right? Like, I never sort of grew up in the cities. I came to the cities uh, largely in for my undergrad. So I was already 18 or whatever. Uh, and I feel like, while it might be a little more less harsh in the cities, simply because you're just exposed to more lives,
Hmm.
uh, rural and suburban India is just a completely different ballgame. And like, right from the get go, from like as early as you can imagine, we are just training boys to be that way.
What do you think are the other ways in which our culture, our system boxes women, or boxes men rather, sorry.
Hmm. Let's talk about the easy ones first. So, like, boys don't cry, or be a man. These phrases, we have finally understood that, okay, these are just tropes that will lead you to down the wrong path. And in fact, now there's like an active sort of campaigning against these tropes, right? But some of the more subtle ones, and provider being, in my opinion, is still a very subtle one, right? Like, uh, we are still sort of skirting around this issue of, uh, guess what, you can be a stay-at-home dad, and that will be totally fine, and that has nothing to do with your gender identity, right? uh, I don't see enough discourse on that. It seems very foreign of an idea, uh, for most people to accept that. And once again, I will double down on that by saying that, maybe you might find such cases in the cities, but we have what majority of India is not a metropolitan city. So challenging that notion of a man as a provider is an extremely big challenge. I feel, is a big one.
One thing is that even in cities, it's still a minority and still somewhat of a stigma because, I personally know a couple of men who are like, I really don't want to work. I'd rather just stay at home.
Right.
But
Right.
it's never something that one indulges them in. It's kind of the response to a statement like that coming from a man is always, haha, nice joke.
Right.
You don't
Right.
actually want to have that conversation and try to understand that maybe there is genuinely a part, something in them that wants to not be the provider and wants to be the more, nurturing presence in the family, or not even
Mhm.
nurturing, just wants to stay at home. pursue
Totally.
something else.
Totally. I think like you used a very key word here, indulge.
Hmm.
And you're right. Like even if we come across such examples, we largely sort of like it's the conversation is quickly segued into something else. We feel very awkward talking about or exploring or going sort of deep into this, right?
Yeah.
Uh, as an appreciation, even, right? And I will also add that what's striking to me is the sense of being a provider and whatnot, right?
Yeah.
Has to be continuous for men, right? Like the moment you hit adulthood, and pick an age, I don't necessarily care, like let's say 22 or 23, right? When you're supposed to like start earning and be an adult and whatnot, it's just nonstop from that point up until your 60s and 70s. That's like 50 nonstop years of shouldering that expectation, right? You can't even take a break,
Yeah.
you know.
Yeah.
Can like adult men like in their 30s and 40s say, hey, guess what, I'm just going to take 5 years off and cultivate my love for art or cultivate my love for writing,
Yeah.
uh, and maybe then get back to doing what I was doing. Even that is an extremely foreign concept,
Yeah.
right? And I don't think, and forget the close families, I don't think society at large sort of indulges, as you said, in even in even in at that stage, right? And we are not talking permanence here, we are talking a short period, right? And some of this is reflective in you know like so I'm 36, by the way, right? So this idea of a mid career, is hovering around my identity these days, right? And I see all these structured programs around, and they call themselves returnships, right? And what is a returnship? A returnship is a concept where, if you have taken a couple of years off because of the birth of your child, then moms who were working in the past, right, can sort of ease back into professional life. Amazing. Like I'm like all for it, but it strikes me that they just like never talk about this concept. Does not include men at all, right? Like because, and not because we won't, but just because we haven't wrapped our head around that. A 2-year break could be something that even men can and should take, perhaps.
Yeah, yeah. Like I
Yeah.
remember recently when Virat Kohli said he wants a paternity leave, there was,
Right.
I mean, of course, there was a lot of praise for that as well, but there were people trolling him too.
Yeah, yeah.
So
Yeah.
even with parenthood, it's so skewed.
Right, right. And imagine you bring up a very funny point, but imagine like Virat Kohli, right? Like he has all the financial means to take off as much time as he wants. And if he's being challenged, like if you like pause for a moment and reflect on that, right? Like you realize that he will continue to be the same person, continue to perhaps even provide in the provider sense for that break, right? Because he is in that position, he has that leverage. So, but for the common man, that is just such an absurd idea. If it is absurd for Virat Kohli, like for the common man, it is just, a very wild, preposterous idea, I believe.
Yeah.
Yeah,
But this also kind of brings me back to what you were saying earlier about how a man's identity is so deeply tied with him being a provider. And now
hmm,
that you say that Virat Kohli can continue providing without actually going to work actively,
right,
that
right,
then opens up a new layer of a man having to be at work. And
right,
you
right.
see a lot of times, there are people who could possibly take a risk,
Hmm,
by switching a career, by starting their own business or something. But
hmm,
there seems to be this pressure to stick to steady money, job safety, all of that, right?
totally.
Am I right about that? It's just I'm thinking out loud.
Yeah, yeah, and I agree with you. And I think like, uh, as you said, right, like even in the case of Virat Kohli, who can provide, in a strict provider sense for as long as he wants without quote unquote working, there's still pressure to get back to work,
Yeah.
right? Which is insane. Like it just like does not add up at all. And
Yeah.
the second thought to it is like, you when you mentioned that there are perhaps people who are in a position to take a risk and start something new, right? The I think we perhaps allow that for men.
Hmm.
The thing that we don't allow is that other thing to be non-financial, right? It has to be a jump from making money in one area to making money in another area. But stripping out the making money part
Hmm.
for perhaps for a decent amount of time is what is like completely off the table, right? Like it is something that everybody gets super anxious and awkward about, I feel.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
I would think.
So yeah, it's a very interesting thing, and as you rightly mentioned, it's sort of like it's in layers in my head at least.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah, absolutely. I think it is very complex and there are many layers and many dimensions to it. And it'll take a long time for us to, unfurl everything, untie the knots.
absolutely,
Yeah.
absolutely, absolutely.
So I'm sure, I mean, I imagine there are certain mental health costs to all of this.
Hmm.
There are a few studies that say that, of course, men don't have uh, an easy outlet to express some of the
Hmm.
difficulties that they go through, and which leads to a high suicide rate among men, high cases of depression that are left undiagnosed, untreated. So there is a huge mental health cost that men do face, and that
Hmm.
doesn't always lead to them getting the help they need.
Hmm.
So when it comes to the kind of pressures that men face to be the provider, to let go of perhaps some ambitions they may have of choosing a non-traditionally masculine field of, a career, even within the family sphere, the roles that they have to live up to. How do you think it impacts their mental health? Like, what's happening?
The way I think about it right now is that we're compromising EQ for IQ, right? That is the gist of what men are being trained. That IQ matters. IQ is what sort of, if it's not your muscles, you better have IQ, right? And if you don't have muscles and if you don't have IQ, God forbid, you're not necessarily, you know, being the man that you should be, right? And there is not even an argument or a consideration for EQ, because EQ is the domain of the feminine, right?
Mm.
And I feel while that was fair in some capacity in the last several decades, we better sort of tweak that a bit for the next few decades, right? Because otherwise the cost, as you mentioned, in terms of mental health and all the physical and psychological issues that men will go through will be so high that
Hmm.
we as a society, I think we will pay a big cost, I think. And the mental health issues are very well known, and thankfully there is a bigger conversation happening on this topic now, and focused on both genders, right? Like focused on rather all genders, I would say. uh, and we just need to give men that space where they can just you know uh, take their blinders off for a second and just be human first, right? And not necessarily worry about getting how they're stacking against the world and all that concept. uh, you can go through a lot of this in your early years without really realizing what's happening to you. You know 20s is a perfect time to think this is all like hoo-ha, right? And you're sort of inevitable and like you can't be touched, right? But as sort of you progress forward, you do realize that things that you have deprived yourself for several years,
Hmm.
and will come back, back and hurt you in a way, right? So I really think that mental health is something men need to cultivate better, which they don't. Yeah, sorry if that was sort of a long-worded answer for, and maybe I segue into something else.
No, absolutely not. I think, like you said, it is important to start talking about mental health for men as well, right? And we just don't talk about
Yeah,
case in
yeah.
point, Sushant Singh Rajput. There was just, I mean, we still, I don't know, which side I lean on in terms of whether it was a murder or suicide, but assuming that it
Hmm.
was suicide, there's so much denial around the fact that he could have very well been depressed and decided
Hmm.
to end his life because he just couldn't get the help or
Absolutely,
support or whatever he needed. um,
absolutely.
so yeah, I think we do need to talk about it. So that's
Hmm.
I'm glad we are talking about it. In your opinion, how do you think people around a man, regardless of their
Hmm.
gender, their role in the man's life, how do you think
Hmm.
people around a man can make it easier to have certain conversations, to express themselves, to break out of this system?
When I think of people around a man who can help men cultivate this, the first people I think of is actually men themselves,
Hmm.
right? Because I believe like women do have a better hang of this. They do understand these physiological concepts better, and maybe that's a manifestation of how they have been groomed. But that's where we are today, right? But as far as when it comes to like male peers or male friends, that is where I feel some of the toxic elements lie, right? And I think of it as and I've sort of penned some of my thoughts on Boyish as well, as a small essay on Boyish, like this idea of gatekeeping in male friendship, right? Like I feel like every single time a young boy wants to be kind, empathetic, or you know effeminate, for lack of a better word, before and male peers or male friends are the first ones to sort of gatekeep that and not let boys be human in a way, right? And that largely manifests from how maybe perhaps our media has trained us to think of masculinity. A lot of young boys get very self-conscious if they see other men acting in ways that they don't think is masculine, right? Which is awkward. I mean, let the other man be. That is your personal anxiety or personal. You need to work on yourself rather than gatekeeping other men, right? Uh, so, for instance, right, like I'll perhaps tell a quick short personal story here. Like back in 2012, that was the first time I took a 1 year break from a professional career, and with no plans whatsoever. And in hindsight, first of all, led me to Menstrupedia, and was just amazing. But those 12 months, perhaps the most questions I've fielded about what's next came from men, right? Largely most men were worried about how am I going to pay the bills and whatnot. Well, which is a fair question to ask, and I'm thankful that they were considerate. But I do understand that some of it was not because I was experimenting, but some of it was actually because they were uneasy in their own lives that somebody could take such a step. When it comes to Boyish, even I certainly hope that if men or boys are reading some of these essays, they understand this and perhaps figure out ways to not do it in their own peer circles.
What can we do to
Yeah,
make the world more hospitable? Because we're not hospitable right now to a lot of groups. So,
right.
what do people do?
Give space to all kinds of ideas, and stick to the ones that you like, but that does not mean that you discredit or disallow other ideas, right? And like creativity or expression, like our ability to express, is so important. Whether it's right or wrong is something that I think individuals can decide for themselves. But at least let the idea exist, right? Like whatever, however wild that might be, and however wild to your worldview that might be, at least give it uh, space. You are free to not engage with it. You're free to not stoke it.
Hmm.
Uh, but if you don't let the idea be, first of all, I actually think that that's just not possible. It will manifest, and it will, you know, come out in another way. Uh, so you just can't control or regulate that,
Yeah.
one, in my opinion. And two, it's just, I think for the future, that's probably the biggest thing that I tend to think of, right? However wild an idea comes across my worldview, I like, the only thing I tend to cultivate is decide if I want to engage with it or not, but I'm not the one to police it around, right?
Yeah, I think really the hope is that one day all of us can coexist in harmony and just let each other be, because we are on our individual paths and that should be okay.
Absolutely, yeah, while the journey, like we're all, like, as you said, I mean, the journey gets pretty personal at at several points in our lives. So um, coexisting is important, and letting others be is very, very important.
Yeah. Great. Thank you so much. I am tempted to ask what's next because I really enjoy your work and I want to see what's coming next, but I'm not going to ask you that. So, but thank you so much for doing this. This was a pleasure. I got to learn a lot, and our conversation has sparked a lot of new things that I think I need to think about more and learn about more, about the lives of men and just gender issues in general. So thank you so much. This was wonderful.